Every year, Joe and I try to establish kinship. Creech and Creed are similar. I say that someone in his family stole a horse, and that explains it, but he's great to work with. He really is. A safe assumption for a conference like this on the humanities and the arts is that the participants can read. So I'm going to turn your attention to the program and let you read about our speaker. But I want to tell you just a few little stories about him because that's what he's going to do for you. He's a master storyteller. This is somewhat of a return for Charles Marsh, for he started as a college student at Samford, but he did not end as a college student at Samford. I wish the story got juicier and had a tinge of, sinister elements to it, but he will tell you that he ran track here and got tired of seeing the backs of the shorts of people from Alabama and Auburn. Also, we didn't have a philosophy program at that time, and we do now. And when I first got here 10 years ago, I said what we need is either a Dutch Reformed or a Catholic philosopher. 10 years later, we got that, so we have a bigger department now. And has roots here, a lot of connections. His uncle is a retired faculty member from here in our divinity school, Fisher Humphreys, and we cherish his legacy. Charles graduated from Gordon College, which is a member school, then went on to Harvard Divinity School and did his doctoral work at Virginia. On a snowy January day about 14 years ago, I was at the American Historical Association meeting in Washington, D.C., looking out the window at what was shaping up to be quite a snowstorm, feeling sorry for the speaker who was scheduled because traffic was snarled and at a stop. But this would be a special occasion because C-SPAN was there with the cameras rolling. And the speaker was this young guy named Charles Marsh, who had written this book everyone was talking about, God's Long Summer. Well, on that snowy day, he brought some light and warmth to the room with the story that he told. And many of you have read that, and you know of his gifts as a writer. He's gone on to do several things after that. This project in Live Theology, most recently has done work on Bonhoeffer, the winner of numerous prizes and awards. And today his topic is very intriguing. Are we still of any use? The audacious hope of the engaged scholar. I think he'll probe, he will push us a little bit, but he'll tell us some good stories. So welcome to this conference, our speaker, Charles Marsh.
Thank you so very much. What a lovely introduction, and it's an honor to be here. I'm especially grateful to all of you who've done such hard and good work on this conference. I've been on your side of the fence many times as the organizer, and I know how many details and headaches go into an event such as this, so thank you very much. My Uncle Fisher taught theology here at Beeson for many years. I'm looking forward to seeing them tomorrow night. But by way of telling you how comfortable I feel sort of in this setting, when I began teaching in Baltimore in 1990, Fisher called me on the phone one day, and he said in his lovely kind of understated way, let's see, Charles, you're a Baptist preacher's son, teaching at a Jesuit college, married to a Presbyterian minister's daughter, attending an Episcopal cathedral, living in a Jewish neighborhood, sending your children to a Quaker school. So this kind of wonderful ecumenism is very much in my heart, and I am so grateful for the vision, the initiatives, the imagination that you bring to this enterprise. And thank you for that kind introduction, and to all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. For the past 15 years, I have had the good fortune of writing, researching, and teaching Live Theology. And it has been my privilege to carry out this mission in the company of many inspiring students, see one here, theologians and practitioners. I have told this story, but it bears repeating. I was once introduced as the director of the project on Livid Theology. and while that may be an apt description of some of my writing over the past several years, I don't think we're quite ready to make that change. Many of you here have offered your time and insight in helping forge new models of partnership between the Academy, the congregation, and the community, and I look forward to our collaborations and exchanges over the next 2 days. I certainly hope my words prove this afternoon to be helpful to our work together and contribute in some way to the flourishing of our vocations as engaged scholars. So, are we still of any use? Part one. In the opening scene of the 1970 film Zabriskie Point, one of Italian director Michelangelo Antonioni's 3 English language films, a contentious debate between black and white students is underway on a California campus. As the camera surveys the scene in a documentary fashion, the students speak in tired revolutionary cliches. Angry black men in berets and army fatigues punctuate violent mantras with seething street wisdom. Molotov cocktails are a mixture of gasoline and kerosene. White radicalism is a mixture of bullshit and jive. A concerned white woman objects that a lot of white people are potential revolutionaries, even as a goateed Marxist complains to the woman that the coffee is run out. Can a man make a cup of coffee around here? She replies in disgust. Black radical Kathleen Cleaver, playing herself, threatens to close down the school because we haven't gotten what we need. Meanwhile, Mark, the film's protagonist, appears agitated and annoyed. He's a white 20-something dropout, and when someone in the group asks if they're willing to die for the cause, Mark rises slowly to his feet and replies, "I'm willing to die, but not from boredom," and takes off. The debate continues briefly in his absence, but the point has been made. These young activists, indeed the wayward children of the movement that began in Montgomery in 1955, have grown to hate each other as much as they hate the system against which they wage vicious, if not inchoate, struggle. A thematic of escape became obsessive in Antonioni's late work in Zabriskie Point and also in his 2 other English language films, The Blow Up, which you probably know better, and The Passenger. Youth movements, countercultures, alternative visions of self and world, experimentations of mind and body come and go as schemes of flight from the flattening effects of a plastic culture. The aching transience that follows a movement's demise anticipates greater, often more frantic movement, unleashing in its wake certain inner repercussions caused by mobility and change, which exhaust themselves in a desperate romp toward death, a physical flight from campus to desert to ruinous city. There are no quiet spaces within or without. There is only flight and a simulacrum of repose. Political movements, countercultures, alternative and experimental communities disappoint the demands of perpetual freedom. Authenticity, to the extent to which it exists, lies finally in radical individuation, but in an individuation that cuts loose all ties to community and proves to be but only another disenchanted option in a one-dimensional universe. So here's a question to get things moving. What became of these student radicals? Taking it to a faceless man. Part 2. The philosopher Richard Rorty pondered such questions as these in his provocative and extremely and mercifully short book, extremely helpful book, Achieving Our Country, leftist thought in 20th century America, based on his Massey lectures at Harvard in 1996, 97, I can't remember which year. I have great admiration for Dick Rorty. I was fortunate enough to attend his lectures shortly after he moved from Princeton to the University of Virginia in the late 80s. And I think his analysis is exceedingly helpful for my comments this afternoon, and I think for our conversations together. Rorty wondered how it came to be that an activist tradition once committed to piecemeal social reform, a generation of intellectuals and activists once concerned with citizenship schools and voter registration, ran aground. Rorty tells a fascinating story. The moral vocabulary of an older reformist activist left, which shaped such progressive movements as the labor and civil rights movement. The courageous work, he says, of those who struggled between 1900 and 1964 within the framework of constitutional democracy to protect the weak from the strong. This generation kept its hand to the plow, committed to piecemeal social reform. It is the old left one hears, for example, in the petitions of the labor and the civil rights organizers in the South and around the nation between these years. The focus is real and concrete and immediate. But by the end of 1964, as the civil rights movement began going cosmic, and the rhetorical pyrotechnics of the student movement and Black Power drowned out the more prosaic talk of the grassroots organizers, the left became increasingly Manichaean in its perceptions. And it is the new left's children one hears in the trendy sobriquets of contemporary culture studies and postmodern theory and the other insular undertakings of the academic guild. Since 1964, the left has increasingly operated, Rorty said, as a spectatorial, disgusted, mocking left, rather than a left that dreams of achieving our country. A fashionably cynical rather than a responsibly hopeful left. Readers of Richard Rorty, admiring or otherwise, will surely know that he was anything but a conservative pundit, coloring the 60s as a period of unrestrained hedonism. Rorty was quick to acknowledge that had this generation of passionate men and women restrained their anger, America might still be sending its young people off to kill Vietnamese. It is even possible, he said, that the Defense Department might lie to the public more frequently and fluently than at present, although that is difficult to imagine. The countercultural experiments of the decade reminded America that there can be beauty in dissent, that resistance makes room for pleasure, and that the mind can climb mountains and soar to imaginative heights. Still, the old reformist left accepted the inevitability of compromising principles and the necessity of sacrifice, and did accomplish much, while the new left believed it should remain pure and never sell out to the dirty, rotten system, and it accomplished very little. In other words, the old left, Rorty continues, inspired social hope and civic participation, while the new left inspired cynicism and a discourse of disgust and detachment. In humanities departments and in intellectual culture, this cynicism and detachment manifested itself in a preoccupation with theoretical description and the crafting of ever exotic, ever more esoteric vocabularies. One fine spring afternoon in Jefferson Hall at the University of Virginia, Rorty even directed his message to the then reigning king of postmodern theology. In this very excellent rejoinder, first, Pascal earned himself a footnote in the theology books by distinguishing between the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of the philosophers. Since Pascal's time, Rorty said, the former God has remained about the same, but the latter God has gotten weirder and weirder. Rorty's Massey lectures read with sermonic urgency. He pleads with the left, or with progressives, as we seem now to prefer, to reckon once again with real human misery, and to set forth clear proposals for social progress, to clamber back down from the high levels of intellectual abstraction to terra firma, where discussions about tax laws, organizing initiatives, housing and immigration policies, and a political candidate might once again be regarded as central virtues of intellectual life. And like many a good sermon, or at least the ones I grew up hearing as a Baptist boy, he made 3 points in his talk. First, he called for a moratorium on theory. Disengagement from practice produces theoretical hallucinations, he proclaimed splendidly. Secondly, he called scholars and intellectuals to rebuild bridges with practitioners and organizers, with workers and policymakers, and with the middle class. Third, he proposed an initiative he called the People's Charter. Rorty imagined the People's Charter as revival-like meetings, during which, he didn't use this language, during which backsliding leftists would repent of their promiscuous and insouciant use of terms like system, late capitalism, the people, the other, and rededicate themselves to the difficult work of piecemeal social reform. Positioning himself in the fellowship of critical patriots and organizers such as John Dewey, Herbert Crowley, and Walter Rauschenbusch, Rorty advanced a pragmatic standard of truth and insisted that progress in knowledge and society should be about attending to and solving the immediate and specific problems that obstruct ever more novel, ever richer forms of human happiness. As I said, he was a teacher of mine, and my admiration is great for his work. His lectures during my graduate student years in the theory-drenched 1980s were sorely needed, and indeed, his lessons were heeded. And for this reason, I have always found it disappointing to realize that his altar call for the renewal of the vocation of the engaged scholar was finally undermined by the limits of his election, a sort of justification by liberal irony alone, and by a surprising lack of generosity. As the old-fashioned kind of atheist, the kind without the slash, he said in that same forum, I keep wishing that we didn't have any theologians. Well, I often entertain the same wish, by the way, but Rorty would say the same thing of anyone who went transcendental, theologian or not, anyone who invoked non-representational ideas in talking about justice, when far less would have been sufficient in his view. Longing for the day when an expansive hope would captivate the hearts and minds of humanity, he longed with an even fiercer passion, I think, for a day when intellectuals, reformers, and organizers would happily dispense with God. By blithely ignoring, at best ignoring, the religious sources of moral and civic engagement, he diminished his own best pragmatic case for renewing the practices of piecemeal social reform and inspiring social hope. So let's ask another question then. What might renew the vocation of the engaged scholar and nourish and sustain her vision? One way of answering this is to address a related question. What motivated those venerable old left social reformers whom Rorty holds up as exemplars, indeed as saviors, for our situation? So this takes me to the third point. And in fact, this takes me to a research project that is rather close to hand, but one that offers a perspective on the matter that I think is altogether pertinent to the lecture and to our conversation together. Bear with me, patient audience, as I turn to a slightly different historical setting, but one that offers, in the end of this story, I think a remarkable perspective on Rorty's hopes. In 1930, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to the United States as a visiting student and fellow at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And in doing so, unwittingly, we might add, moved deep into the same progressive culture whose demise Rorty mourned, lamented in achieving our country. When Bonhoeffer arrived in Manhattan, he was a straight-arrow academic whose star was rising, a 24-year-old privat docent at the University of Berlin who had written already 2 doctoral dissertations and completed a rigorous training in classical German philosophy, church history, biblical studies, and modern theology. Bonhoeffer had little respect for, and quite frankly, little interest in American intellectual and religious life. His sights were set on a lifetime of academic accomplishments and the rich rewards of the Guild. It has come to this, Bonhoeffer complained shortly after arrival at Union, that this seminary has forgotten what Christian theology in its very essence stands for. The principal doctrines here are in utter disarray, he said. In America, it would appear that it is possible to enter the ministry without having a clue what one believes, or without really believing anything at all. Rorty would be pleased, no? On one occasion, Bonhoeffer approached Reinhold Niebuhr, who had been teaching at Union for 2 years, whose course on religion and ethics Bonhoeffer took in the fall semester, and asked with indignation, "Is this a theological seminary or a training center for politicians?" Bonhoeffer was further dismayed during his class presentation on Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will, when classmates began laughing out loud at the very notion of justification by faith. But when Bonhoeffer left America 10 months later, he left with a transformed perspective on social engagement, faith, and historical responsibility. It's the problem of concreteness that at present so occupies me, he wrote in his notes upon his return to Berlin. This from the same scholar who had less than a year earlier found American pragmatism an offense to Germanic precision and had said that Americans order up their religion the way one would order a car from the factory. He began to lay aside his professional ambitions, to involve himself in urban social ministries in Berlin, to fall in love with the Bible. Something had happened in those 10 months. Eberhard Bethge wrote in his magisterial biography of 1967. So I ask for a minute, let's follow along the question, what happened? And see how it may speak to concerns raised earlier in the paper. I think that despite the hand-wringing over Protestant liberalism American style, Bonhoeffer's studies, his encounters, his exchanges, his experiences, his travels in America introduced him to a greater cloud of witnesses, as he actually wrote in his journal later in the year, and inspired an enfleshment of the concepts he had formulated so precisely in his dissertation and academic writings: a community for others, Christus als Gemeinde existieren, Christ existing as community, costly discipleship, and it offered him some profound relief from the melancholy of North German Lutheranism, to tweak Karl Barth's reference to the melancholy of the North German plains. Since Reinhold Niebuhr's arrival in Union in 1928, a cadre of progressive social reformers, many core members or future leaders of the Old Left, had turned to him for support time and again, and Niebuhr, time and again, offered financial and moral and spiritual and organizing support graciously. In his marvelous book, Against the Grain, Southern Radicals and Prophets, 1929 to 1959, the writer Anthony Dunbar, wonderful book, I highly recommend it. My University Press of Virginia has recently issued a new paperback edition. Dunbar writes that without Niebuhr's inspiration and practical assistance, these movements might have not existed or succeeded to the extent to which they did. Niebuhr's encouraging presence and his organizing and fundraising expertise are pervasive in the letters and exchanges of the intentional communities and the progressive congregational initiatives that arose and flourished in this remarkably fertile time of American social theology. In fact, most of the men and women comprising the old reformist left, the old put your hand to the plow progressive culture, worked steadfastly in the tradition of the social gospel. Clarence Jordan, one of the founders of the Quintanilla Farm in Americus, Georgia, and I'm sure a hero of many in this audience. As you know, the organization Habitat for Humanity eventually grew out of this experiment in community, described the mission of this interracial cooperative farm on 400 forlorn acres in southwest Georgia as a demonstration plot for the kingdom of God. To be sure, Niebuhr's emerging Christian realist views were beginning to call into question the idealism and utopianism of much of the social gospel. Niebuhr was hard at work at the time on moral man and immoral society, but it speaks, I think, to Niebuhr's big-heartedness and his wisdom, his kindness, that even as he was rejecting many of the naively optimistic sort of presuppositions of the social gospel, or even claims that the age of perpetual peace was arriving by our efforts in the social order, he embraced, nonetheless, the socially transformative energies of the social gospel, encouraging innovations in organizing and in community building, and he did not discourage a little utopianism at the ground level. That is the kind of utopianism that often inspires, creative solutions to concrete problems. I would say that, to make a longer section short, that while Bonhoeffer remained critical of Niebuhr's liberal Protestantism and engaged in fascinating exchanges with Niebuhr, it was nonetheless a transformative encounter. And that more than the letter of Niebuhr's work, it was the spirit of Niebuhr's vocation, the model of the engaged theologian, that I think we hear when Bonhoeffer later talked about costly discipleship and costly grace, when he talked about the concreteness of revelation, when he talked about Jesus for others, when he talked about responsibility, ultimate honesty. Bonhoeffer further encountered the American organizing tradition in his studies with two influential, though largely forgotten teachers, Harry Ward and Charles Weber, and in first-hand participation through their classes in local church-based organizing. I don't have time to talk about Harry Ward today, but I would like to add a second recommendation to your reading list, and it's the wonderful book by a Baptist scholar who died far too young, named David Nelson Duke, called In the Trenches with Jesus and Marx, Harry F. Ward and the Struggle for Social Justice. David Duke and I were able to meet in New York in 1990, and he was actually working on much of this material at the time, and it's very sad that the research never made it to light. Charles Weber was a pastor, organizer, professor of practical theology at Union, and author of the book, A History of the Development of Social Education in the United Neighborhood Houses of New York. You can add that to your reading list if you want, I'm not sure. Later in the 1950s and 1960s, he served as the National AFL-CIO representative, the Industrial Secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Bonhoeffer took Weber's Church and Community in the fall semester of 1930. The course resembled what we sometimes call, in the United States these days, a service learning experience, though it was much more than that. Weber used the course to introduce seminarians to the lived theologies of the cities in the throes of economic distress, and to the impressive displays of social ministries flourishing in New York. He arranged site visits for the class, and Bonhoeffer could hardly believe his eyes, having been educated in an academic culture in which professors remained, if nothing else, sort of imperious in their relations to their minions. Bonhoeffer couldn't believe it. Professor Weber accompanied the students as they journeyed from the Union Quadrangle to take part in organizing initiatives based in New York churches and synagogues. In connection with the course of Mr. Weber's, Bonhoeffer wrote, "I paid a visit almost every week to one of these character-building agencies, settlements, YMCA, home missions, cooperative houses, playgrounds, children's courts, night schools, socialist schools, asylums, youth organizations, Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It is immensely impressive to see all this self-sacrifice and how much devotion, energy, and responsibility is done in these efforts." The students visited the National Women's Trade Union League and the Workers' Education Bureau of America. They discussed, Bonhoeffer said, labor problems, restriction of profits, civil rights, juvenile crime, and the activity of the churches in these fields. And they studied the role of the churches in selective buying campaigns and public policy, drawing on models and insights gleaned from the Southern Tenants Farm Workers Union and the Delta Cooperative, among others. The class also met with officials from the American Civil Liberties Union, the nation's premier defender of civil liberties, which after its founding in 1920 had focused heavily on the rights of conscientious objectors and the protection of resident aliens from deportation. When Bonhoeffer returned to Berlin in the summer of 1931, he told his older brother that Germany would need an ACLU of its own. Through his field work with Weber, this nearly forgotten, as I said, professor of practical theology, a pathway was illuminated from Bonhoeffer, from the theological classroom to the concrete social situation. And many of the phrases of progressive American social thought began to pepper his sermons, writings, and letters. The circle of Christian reformers into which Bonhoeffer moved at Union also included numerous students who would disperse later into urban centers and backwater hamlets in pursuit of social and economic justice and racial equality. And so I'd like to say a few words about some of these characters. This cadre of reformers included activist pastors John King Gordon, William Klein, Gaylord White, Jim Dabrowski, and Miles Horton. A word about two of these. And I'm moving along here. We have maybe 20 more minutes. I've got to say a quick word about Dabrowski, because long after Bonhoeffer had laid aside his volumes of William James of Harvard University, whom he read at Union in a year-long tutorial with Eugene Lyman, he inquired in letters later in his life of that other James, that is James Dombrowski, and his new American friends and acquaintances. Dombrowski was a Methodist minister born in Florida who, after finishing Union, earned a doctorate at Columbia University with a dissertation on called The Early Days of Christian Socialism in America. Choosing a career in organizing over academe, in 1934, Dombrowski established the Conference of Younger Churchmen of the South. And from 1942 to 1946, he served as the executive director of the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. In his role as executive director of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, he edited the Progressive Southern Patriot from 1946 to 1966. And he worked behind the scenes with many of the key players in the 1956 Montgomery bus boycott. Dombrowski was part of this remarkable generation of Southern progressives whose organizing and educational efforts prepared the ground for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And among this company of Southern dissidents and prophets, we should also remember Howard Buck Hester and Sherwood Eddy and Lillian Smith and Lucy Randolph-Macon and Jesse Daniel Ames and Miles Horton, who became, against all odds, one of Bonhoeffer's closest friends at Union. So I want to say a quick word about this pillar of the old reformist left. Miles Horton was a country boy from the riverboat town of Savannah, Tennessee, and most surely represents a kind of theological student inconceivable to Bonhoeffer before his year in America. Horton grew up in southern rural poverty of the sort documented by James Agee and Walker Evans in their landmark volume, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. He was educated at Cumberland College, a school set up for poor whites in Appalachia, and spent many of his student summers working in vacation Bible schools in the mountains of East Tennessee. He said later in an interview that the only reason he was ever admitted to Union was because the seminary was looking for a token hillbilly. In the 1930s and 1940s, he established, with the help of Jim Dombrowski, the Highlander Folk School. And the Highlander Folk School emerged as one of the most important training centers in these golden years of Protestant social activism, equipping Southern workers with skills for labor organizing and helping launch the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1950s, the Highlander Folk School, under Miles Horton's direction, turned its attention from labor to the burgeoning civil rights movement and helped train such church-based organizers as Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, and Martin Luther King, Jr. Some of you may have seen in photographs a familiar kind of icon of white anti-civil rights propaganda, the photograph of a towering billboard that appeared along southern highways in the late 50s and early 60s, featuring a photograph of a group of men and women being trained in organizing at the Highlander Folk School, and a young Martin Luther King Jr. is sitting on the front row, and a large red banner under the photograph reads, Martin Luther King at Communist Training Center. These representatives of the American organizing tradition were probably the most radical Christians with whom Bonhoeffer ever associated, the scholar Clifford Green writes. And they were radicals not only in theory. They worked on urban and rural poverty, on racial justice, and civil rights, and union organizing, on peacemaking, and at the UN. And let us not forget, though we don't have time for this in any detail, Bonhoeffer's intense 6-month immersion in the African American church, prompted by Birmingham's own Frank Fisher, the son of a Baptist minister in this city, who, as one of the 2 black seminarians at Union in 1930, invited the young German theologian one Sunday morning to join him for services at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And in time, Bonhoeffer, in his fine German tailored suits and silk ties, began teaching a Sunday school class for boys at Abyssinian, and a Wednesday evening women's Bible study. And on at least one occasion, he preached in the pulpit of the esteemed Adam Clayton Powell, Sr. In the spring of that year, in 1931, Bonhoeffer, with a Swiss friend and a friend from France, borrowed an old third-hand car and drove into the heartland of America, logging over 2,000 miles behind the wheel of this third-hand car, and 1,500 more on train in Mexico. And in that journey, Bonhoeffer drove along a highway that would have cut on his return to New York through New Orleans and Laurel, Mississippi, and Meridian, Mississippi, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Birmingham, and Huntsville, and Chattanooga, and Bristol, and into the eastern part of my state of Virginia, back on the way to New York. He passed by within 10 miles of Scottsboro just weeks after the trial of the Scottsboro boys began, and he wrote notes on this in his theological journal. Well, back in Berlin, in the fall of 1931, as I mentioned earlier, he fell in love with Scripture, and he embraced a rich devotional life. He said, I'm feeling like I'd rather call myself a Christian than a theologian. He embraced a devotional life that was often animated by African American spirituals and gospel standards. He organized retreats at his hut in the forest near Brennau, And he encouraged his students to read the Bible with openness to God's voice and attention to the outcast and reviled. He was drawn into an intimate, transformative reading of the Sermon on the Mount, the most radical teachings in the gospel narratives, and at the same time affirmed the importance of the Christian religion's rootedness in Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. Bonhoeffer was now moving in response to a new understanding of faith, and as we know, he would only come to speak more passionately of communities of obedience and prayer, of costly grace, of spiritual disciplines that bring purification, clarification, and concentration upon the essential thing, and of responsible action in a world come of age. The year in America, as he said, inspired a turning from the phraseological to the real. Bonhoeffer had moved directly into the heart of Rorty's venerable old left, this vanquished generation of scholars and intellectuals committed to piecemeal social reform. And guess what? They were mostly church people. Radical, Bible-thumping organizers, hanging with Jesus in the trenches. They were theologians. Well, it is true that in the closing decade of the 19th century, one heard frequent complaints within the ranks of the labor movement of the church's lack of involvement. But that same year, 1892, Walter Rauschenbusch, who, did I mention this earlier, was Richard Rorty's maternal grandfather, led a group of Protestant ministers and theologians to pledge their allegiance to the practical realization in the world of the kingdom, to the marching host of labor. And by 1930, social activism in America was saturated with theological conviction. The radical Christians who made up these flourishing organizations and campaigns spoke passionately of justice for the workers, revolt of the rednecks, land for the landless, full and decent employment, the holding in common of all natural resources and all scientific processes, the liberation of workers from enslavement to the machine. These men and women cared for the poor and oppressed through a broad range of initiatives in community and union organizing and in educational reform. And they used the power of testimonial and narrative to educate the nation about poverty, presenting heartbreaking portraits of day laborers who swelled the ranks of the dispossessed, squeezed out by the large corporations and plantations, insurance companies and banks, of homeless families combing the South for a decent living, adrift on the rivers in flatboats, in the coves, swamps, and on the barren hillsides, a great mass of wanderers without homes, food, or work, half-clothed, sick of body and soul, unwanted and unloved in the kingdom of King Cotton. We were trying to tell these folk, Howard Kester said, that they were loved and wanted in the kingdom of God, to call attention to the implications of the Christian faith for all humanity. Such accounts as these offered a vivid and synoptic realism about social existence, precisely because they had seen a light in the darkness. On the last Christmas before he was arrested by the Gestapo, Christmas 1942, Bonhoeffer wrote an essay to his pastoral colleagues, his family and friends, his fellow dissenters and conspirators, in which he tried to make sense of the tumultuous 10 years that had passed in the resistance and in the conspiracy. He said in this astonishing piece, sometimes titled After 10 Years, that he had learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, and the reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. He said, "We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. Experience has rendered us suspicious of too many things, and often we have failed to speak to them, to the world, a true and open word." Then he asked, "Are we still of any use?" His answer, in many respects, harkened back to the engaged scholars he had encountered in America, whose turning to the real had proved transformative in his own journey to reality. It harkened back to many things and evoked many sources. We will not need geniuses, he said. We will not need cynics. We will not need people who have contempt for others. We will not need cunning tacticians. What we will need are simple, uncomplicated, and honest human beings. We must find our way back to simplicity and to honesty. If we are still of any use, Bonhoeffer would say, just months later and a year before his murder in a concentration camp, it is because in Jesus, God has said yes and amen to it all. And that yes and amen is the firm ground on which we stand. Let's go back this last 4 minutes to the opening scene in Zabriskie Point, in that movie that I mentioned earlier. And let us ask briefly, and in closing, what happened there? Rorty's fine narrative, in so many ways helpful, notwithstanding, it is clear to me, and I think from a close look at the historical record, that the movement that began in the South in the 1950s, that reached and into the early 1960s and dissipated after 1964, when at one rap session in 1966, new vanguard members of SNCC deemed Miss Fannie Lou Hamer of Ruleville, Mississippi, no longer relevant, no longer at our level of development. That the dissipation of that movement happened because it lost its anchor in the theological convictions that had animated and for a while sustained the movement. Clarence Jordan always preferred the phrase God movement anyway to describe the peaceable reign of God, the hidden meaning of all movements for liberation and reconciliation, the hidden meaning which brings us together for these days as strangers and yet as friends. Indeed, beloved community is not self-generating. Behind it stands the event and the power by which it lives and is nourished. Thomas Merton once described the civil rights movement as the greatest example of Christian faith in action in the social history of the United States. If this is true, and I think it is, then it bears emphasizing that the logic of the dream was theologically specific. Beloved community as the realization of God's love in lived social relation. Fred Shuttlesworth told us that he found strength in the everlasting arms of Jesus. The dream burst forth from the audacious hope that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, tearing down the walls of separation. In the God movement, community building and piecemeal social reform, social hope and progress find their ground and nourishment in disciplines and practices of gratitude, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Finally, are we still of any use? One page. Once in an interview years ago when I was working on research in the civil rights movement, a kindly minister who had been recalling his years as a staff member of the National Council of Churches and his role in the 1965 March on Selma, paused and said to me, looking straight in my eyes, "You know, your generation is a bunch of wimps." Well, on that day I resolved, being a wimp and all, that the least I could do was to ask a few hard questions about my vocation as a scholar and teacher, and somehow try to make that connection back to life, somehow try to make that turning from the phraseological to the real. So I offer only now a provisional sketch, but I offer this in closing. To speak of the audacious hope of the engaged scholar in the context in which I work, is to commit ourselves to sober judgment and forthright speech. The church has an obligation, Merton continued, not to join in the incantation of political slogans and in the concoction of pseudo-events, but to cut clear through the deviousness and ambiguity of both slogans and events by her simplicity and her love. Engaged scholarship is faithful standing in the place where we are, a prayerful openness and discerning attention to the story of God told in creation and history, but it is more than mere presence. Engaged scholarship lives under the storied communication of God's will for humanity. Jesus born in a manger, for there was no room for him in the inn. Hope is neither an ironic pose nor a rhetorical strategy, but a lived response to an ontological fact. It is, as Barth said in an earlier address, to take the whole situation upon us in gratitude to God, and with audacity tempered by love, to enter into the movement of the era. So let us then stand in solidarity with the excluded and with the disenfranchised, remembering that faith's practices are not intended to expand our personal pleasure or produce novelty. Let us throw ourselves in all our humdrum task and the ordinary work of mercy and justice. Let us act boldly against the powers of death that surround us and reclaim from the cults of insipid godliness the courage to offend the pious and the proud. Let gratitude and the humility of participation shape our devotion to life. Let us resolve to make and keep others free. And let us resist the urge to colonize God for our own group's needs, even as we seek to keep redemptive spaces open. Let us live with passionate worldliness in this brilliant and fleeting time of our mortal life. And let our witness to peace grow out of the convictions of our faith, the audacity of our hope, and the generosity of our love. And let us never forget that the community of Christ exists as a structure with four sides open to the world. Thank you.